now that we've expressed all of our existential problems to the world or to each other, we can now focus on the conversation, which is going to be a little bit sporadic, not unnormal, of course.
Yeah, I was like, it's going to be a normal conversation for this podcast. Now we're going to be a bit
Yes.
sporadic. No, we're going to be doing exactly what we usually do. Right, as if we have a plan. As we have a guest, we have no plan.
Well, I mean, even with guests, we don't really have plans. We say, hey, let's have a chat. Okay. And then we chat.
Yeah.
So internet in schools is what the general theme of this is going to be about. And for me, this directly relates to the phone ban conversation we were discussing earlier, and I've discussed previously on the podcast and inside of the Discord about phone bans in schools and problematic phone use. And the way I would actually see it is less problematic phone use and problematic internet use. Because some people use their smartphones, or they use their iPads, or their laptops, or their tablets, or just any tech, really. And so for me, as someone that has grown up partly with tech, partly without tech inside of school, I think the BlackBerry phone was like a thing when I was in primary school. What was I, year 5? Yeah. Obviously, the Nokia was the big one when you first start, the Nokia brick that everyone refers to, but it wasn't really a phone. Like, it was a phone, but it wasn't a phone.
Hot take for you this morning. The Nokia is not a phone.
It's okay. It's nothing groundbreaking when it comes to when you compare phones, like the Nokia brick phone to the really old, all you can do is dial and call phones. All the Nokia had was like the Snake game. Like, that's all.
And that right there is why it's fucking genius.
But I hated the game.
That sounds like a you problem.
Every time I played it, I'm like, this is so boring. This is so boring. Which is why I always play football with a tennis ball, because we weren't allowed to play football with a proper football because health and safety reasons. Yeah, I know. So all of our school shoes got scuffed because we ended up kicking the floor because the tennis ball was so small. Sometimes, this is how bad it got. Sometimes the tennis ball broke because it was not been like designed for people kicking it. And obviously when you tackle, you squash the ball together, and tennis balls are two halves. So sometimes we had half a tennis ball, and because we had no tennis ball, so people, this is my primary school, right? This is how the primary school worked when I was there for sports. We weren't allowed to use footballs, so we used tennis balls because they were allowed to be used. But people didn't buy tennis balls to play tennis. So we had, like, we as students, as children, would buy tennis balls to take a tennis ball into school to use as a football. We would go outside of schools to try and find tennis balls in the grass and the hedges to use them at lunchtime and break time as footballs. And if one broke and no one had a tennis ball, you'd use half a tennis ball. So if you were to go to any of the people, like the sporty people in my year group at school, in their bags would be their books, their pens, and 2 or 3 tennis balls. Because if a tennis ball went over the fence, you'd get another tennis ball out. Yeah. But welcome to my life at primary school. Anyway.
How is a tennis ball safer than a football?
I have no idea. When a tennis ball hits you in the face, it really hurts.
It hurts more than a bloody football.
Yes.
Physics.
And it's easier to miss it as well.
Physics.
Yeah.
Football, bigger. Tennis ball, smaller. Physics.
So I'm on top of that then. Sometimes we weren't allowed to. Yeah, I know. Forget internet in schools. Sometimes, when we weren't allowed to play football because it was too wet and it was unsafe, or there'd been like an incident about something at school, and the teacher goes, "Okay, we're going to ban football in the playgrounds for however many weeks." We'd play something called throwball, right? It's not handball, which is like what you may think of, like European handball. It's similar though, so it's still using a tennis ball. We came up with this game, and we used this game when we were at school. I have no idea if it's an actual thing, but it's basically football, but you can't throw anything in the opponent's half. So essentially, you're split into teams, and when you get the ball, you have to throw the ball into the goal on the other side, but you can't get past the halfway line. So essentially, you run to the halfway line and you throw it as hard as you physically can at the goal, and everyone else is going to try and stop it. Yeah.
That sounds so much safer.
So sometimes we'd play with 2 or 3 tennis balls. So you'd have like one tennis ball being launched miles in the air at your goal, the other one being launched like directly because you're standing in front of the goal at your face. So you're like, I'm looking forward so I don't get hit by that ball, but I need to make sure the ball in the air doesn't smack me in the head. So yeah, I loved that. That it was a great game. Obviously, when loads of people had tennis balls, it got a little bit chaotic because hey, kids, like 7 tennis balls going at once is kind of like really hard to keep track of. So balls got thrown in face, and then as soon as like enough people got hurt, they let us play football again. Welcome to school in the early 2000s.
And that's why I used to hide behind the door. In my primary school, there was like a little corner behind the door which leads out into the playground. I just stayed in that corner. Didn't play any sport because there was a football going around all the time. And due to my sight, couldn't see it, so I always got hit.
Yeah. Yeah, see, I had 2 eyes at that time, but obviously I was always half deaf. So if there was something coming or someone shouting at me, I had no idea where the noise, what anything was coming from. I would just duck. As soon as if I heard my name, I would duck. Because I can't dodge it. I don't know where the thing's coming from, where they're shouting from. I'm like, I'm gonna be a ball and then stand up like a second or 2 later and see what happened. Yeah, I got bullied from it sometimes. They were like, oh, Danny, watch out. So I'd duck because I have no idea what's going on. And everyone would laugh. I'm like, ah, okay, fine, whatever. Then I'd get a tennis ball and throw it out. So, yeah. Anyway, back to the topic of conversation. When it comes to phones in school or technology in school, I grew up, as just expressed, in school that didn't really have tech, didn't use tech that much. But when I got into secondary school, sort of year 7, year 8, that's where I started playing on Xbox and technology started really coming out. I used the phone, but I didn't really use it that much. And it wasn't really until my master's degree that I used a phone the way people use a phone now and use the internet the way they do now. So when I look at the internet in schools, I can't conceptualize what that looks like as a younger individual, which means I need to look at evidence, look at conversations, look at other teachers. But what I can do is look at learners and how learners typically learn from past experiences. And we know that conversation is where learning happens. Where best to have conversation than in person and online?
Yeah.
Which to me is really telling of this actually relates to a conversation going on in Discord at the moment, really telling about the politicians that are trying to push these policies. They don't really understand the benefits that technology could have. And I don't think they really understand the limitations that they're imposing on various different tools that could be used by technology. Yes, there are negative things. Yes, you could say as a conclusion, phones in the grand scheme of things are negative because they foster negative behaviors with social media. They are addictive. They can be distractions and all these other things. Yes, they are concluding lines. They are endpoints, but how you get to that endpoint is important. And that's where I think the discussion points inside of the articles get overlooked by politicians. But I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this as having 2 kids that use tech.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I have a fascinating conflict when it comes to tech and my kids. Because if I follow my what I've grown up with, the environment that I was in, tech was seen as not necessarily bad, but it is not the default thing to do. You should go outside, you should go do this, you should go do that. You shouldn't be on your phone all the time, shouldn't be on the computer all the time, shouldn't be on XYZ, etc., etc. Shouldn't be doing any of that. And at first, that was my reaction. And then I realized how full of shit I was. Because I'm on technology all the time. Yes, it's my job, but I am on technology even when I'm not working. So how can I go, no, you're not allowed, blah, 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 blah,
So
when I do it?
this is one of the biggest irritations I have with a lot of these scientists that talk about pedagogy versus andragogy. Pedagogy being how children learn, essentially. That's oversimplified, but essentially all you need to know, really, unless you're in the fields anyway. And andragogy is for adults, right? When I look at the comparison, some people say, oh, children are mini adults, which I don't like the segregation of children and adults. It's an age that doesn't really mimic someone's expertise, because a 15-year-old child may have 10 years of experience in something, and an adult may have 1 year of experience in something. So that 15-year-old child actually has high expertise in something the adult doesn't. So I find the category comparisons kind of irrelevant. But when I hear adults and people in andragogy say, that's not what it was like when I was your age, or I didn't need that when I was at school. Yeah, that's when you were at school. If you're a 40-year-old person, when you were at school, these things didn't exist. So even if you wanted to, you couldn't use them. So if we look at what you're doing now that you have access to those things,
You're using them.
you're using them.
Recently with Aiden, he was talking about his like learning how he wants to make a menu for a thing that he wants to do when he's older, like creating a restaurant of his own. And he was asking us, and he was making this like menu, and he put something down at like a couple of pence. I'm like, that's cool. But how are you going to make money? What do you mean? Well, you've got to make money in a business. You've got to make what's called a profit. Oh, do you know how much pepperoni is? No. Okay, go look it up. So he got his tablet and was looking it up. Oh, okay. And he was writing it down. And he was writing it. £16 for a pizza. I'm like, okay.
Okay.
That's an expensive pizza. Have a look at what else it costs. And so it was nice to see him engaging in technology as an educational tool, not just as a distraction tool. And it took him, he was quite shocked, because as he looked at me, I was saying, go on your tablet, look it up. Go on your tablet, look it up. And he was just like, what?
I don't have to know this from memory.
Yeah. I was like, go look it up. Go on, have a look. Now he needs the search skills, which is annoying because they don't teach search skills until year 9, year 10.
That there is the irritation I have with the way things are taught at school. So I was watching a video essay yesterday from Zoe B about historians and how they're somewhere in America. I can't remember exactly what it was because I wasn't that interested in it. I was more interested in the actual learning science. But they're using this online video platform to teach kids, but it's basically watch the video and answer a worksheet question thing after the video. You're like, that's not learning, that's not teaching. They need to be exploring something. That's just a lecture in a video format. That is not doing anything that we're not already doing. And one of the points that she made in the video is that we need to be having conversations and people need to explore and discuss ideas critically. And how do we do that if we're in a room with people that don't know? Use the internet, because the internet contributes to that conversation. Yeah, it can be a distraction, but if you're interested in the conversation, it's no longer a distraction, it's a help.
And it's interesting because instead of just assuming that he's looking at things that he shouldn't be looking at, or he's just watching random stuff, he's actually watching educational videos on YouTube. And I've given him access to YouTube, and he's now looking and watching videos about a whole host of different things.
I'm curious, when you say educational videos, what isn't an educational video?
I knew that was coming because I heard it. I was like, well. A video which is designed to teach, to show and share information. That's a load of shit. All videos are educational videos in some way, shape, or form. I know.
Okay, so working on the assumption that all videos can be educational, what videos would you suggest schools encourage or look to use? Because what schools are worried about is, oh, they're going to get distracted and go elsewhere. Obviously, if you're watching someone play a game, let's just watch this person play the game, that is educational for the game, but it's not goal directed towards the learning objectives or outcomes of the lesson inside of school. So how would you then direct, if you want to direct students' use of internet use in school? Would you, I guess, would be the first question.
Well, that's a very multi-layered question. It depends on the context I'm in. Am I an educator, teacher slash, or am I a parent? Because I treat them slightly differently.
Why?
As a parent, which I also don't like when I'm saying that immediately, because I'm like, well, yeah, I am. Am I in a teaching environment or am I in a parental environment? Like, what is my focus for them?
Okay, let's think about the pop for a second and jump into our little lexicon. What do you mean when you say teacher and teaching?
Damn it. So teaching, I think, is showing someone something, which basically completely destroys everything I just said. I love it. I need to put that in. I don't have that in. I have that in my head, but I do not have that in my
Lexicon.
actual lexicon. So you put that one in.
Yeah, this is something I struggled with when I was at uni, comparing coaching and teaching, because coaching is different from teaching. But why is it? They're both educating, but coaching and teaching are different. The way I conceptualize teaching is done by a teacher, and a teacher has professional qualifications. Those professional qualifications uphold standards and are conformed in a specific environment, typically a school. So teaching, for me, is where a teacher educates in a formal environment, which means that education, which is what we're talking about, can still happen outside of teaching, which I think holds true, which means parents can act like teachers, but parents are educators.
Yeah.
That's the way I would express those terms. So jumping back into the question, now that we've popped our lexicon, we've done a bit of popping. Jumping back in now, how would you confine the internet use, video specifically, inside of a lesson if you were to be a teacher? And if you weren't to be a teacher, as an educator, what would you do? I personally prefer this question as an educator because I don't like the constraints teachers have.
Yeah, that was kind of my thing. As an educator, would I don't know whether I would constrain it as such. I wouldn't limit is where what I'm hearing from constrain. It also depends on most of the time, no. Unless they ask a specific question about a specific thing. And I'm like, I don't know. Let's go find out. And then maybe there is a directed behavior there. But most of the time I would rather he explore things he enjoys and is interested in than than do nothing or just watch a video of someone playing a game.
Right. So what I found interesting there is I have partly deliberately put you into a situation that I wanted you to go to. I kind of set the question up to be like, I wonder if he goes down here, and you did. The way that I see the answer to this question, which is why I asked the question in the first place, is it comes down to practice design and representative practice. I'm glad you went the way you did, because representative practice typically is done inside of sport. Like, kicking a ball against a wall is not that representative of passing in a football match, to use a popular sport. When we look at classroom settings, it's very difficult to say, oh, that's representative practice or not.
No.
When we look at education, and education in real world settings, how do we actually learn in our own time? Representative practice doesn't have constraints.
No.
Because we're not constrained by the internet. So the school adds constraints, which reduces the representativeness of the education and the learning. So if we look at it from an educator's perspective, forgetting teachers for a second, okay, so how do we then constrain these individuals to learn something? Well, now we're looking at representative practice. First, do they need to be constrained? Is the difficulty of the environment, the relationship between them and the environment, too much for them to manage? Desirable difficulty is then a concept that we would use, something we use in representative practice design. If it is, then we add a constraint, something from constraints-led approach to coaching. If it isn't, then we would look at affordances. We look at attunement of affordances. We can look at expertise of their ability to focus or attune to affordances. All of these terms coming from sports coaching and the constraints-led approach applied to using technology in school. So if they have the internet, that's a vast place for them to explore. If they have too much information, they have too many questions, they have no idea where to start, or they don't know what the point is, then you would constrain the environment as the educator in either directing them at a question, directing them at a problem, or constraining the tools that they have to start with, maybe constraining the time they have, constraining the output. So saying, you're going to make a 5-minute video, you're going to write 1,000 words about this, you're going to answer 4 questions, you're going to talk to that person. Add a constraint to the task environment. So the practice design, the individual now has to try and find a solution to that. Well, if you've got 10 minutes to do something, there are 2 constraints. You've got to do something and you've got 10 minutes. Well, now watching this game is not going to get me to the goal. So they can't now do what they still have the opportunity to do that. So the affordance is still there, but it doesn't align with the goal-directed behavior, the representative practice of actually getting to the objective in traditional teaching senses, the learning objective. That's the way I would articulate how to use the internet in schools. It's not saying you can't use phones, you can't use the internet. Set them a task, set them a challenge, create an environment for students that can use the tools and use the tools to help them get there if it actually helps. If they realize they've been on the internet for half an hour, they've got 10 minutes left of the lesson, they've got to get something done, they've got to go, you know what, I just got to write something. And they've learned that, okay, maybe I shouldn't have done all of these other searches on the internet to try and find the solution. So now in the next lesson, they realize, actually, I don't want to do all the searching because in the last lesson, I didn't have enough time to finish it. Now they're learning healthy internet use through school, which is obviously a lifelong skill. That's my view on it.
Yeah, I agree.
Do you have any questions about that? Or is there anything that comes up, limitations about that approach?
None that are mine. None that are like not built from preconceived notions, which I recognize.
Go on. Because obviously this conversation is about airing them, and I don't want to be like...
it's literally obviously my previous experience of the internet of like, oh, shouldn't do this, shouldn't do that, overprotection, trying to make sure that they're doing the right thing, which isn't a thing, which I know. And so it's interesting, especially with the difference between the two, whereas Erin is just watching stuff. And so it's really interesting, the difference, whereas Aiden is traditionally learning stuff. If we look at it like that, she is not learning stuff, except she is learning stuff. She's learning social interaction through cartoons and other things and other concepts. So I started asking, which is after a previous conversation, I think you mentioned this. I'm like, oh, that's a good point. And so I just started asking, and it was interesting to see her responses.
Out of curiosity, have you noticed anything through your questions? Noticed anything in the way that she's behaving from cartoons? Because from my experience, kids mimic what they see. So if something happens in a cartoon, she'll do it.
Yes.
Do you ask her why she's doing those things?
Yes.
What did she say?
I don't know.
Okay.
Or because it's funny.
Yeah.
And in fact, I do those things too, because I know the cartoon she's watching. So I use the same voices because it's something that I enjoy. And she loves that.
Yeah. It's it's interesting how when we're younger, because of our either, well, I don't want to put an age to it, but lack of vocabulary or lack of experience expressing different behaviors through words,
Mm.
I don't know is the easy answer.
Mm.
But we do know, because otherwise we wouldn't do it. Like, it's a behavior that we've gained through experiences, because that's what we learn. I will be publishing an article by the time this goes out. It will be published about the assumptions that we take with gaining knowledge and the tabula rasa and us not having knowledge at birth. I would argue that we do, and that we gain knowledge through experiences. But if we've got the knowledge, then we do know, in quote marks, we do know. We just can't articulate it, and they are two different types of knowledge: knowledge about and knowledge of. That's that's another conversation. But that to me is really interesting for a couple of reasons. One, when you then look at those individuals that are learning different things from topics, I would then want to go, okay, what are the limitations of that? Because there's got to be a limitation of them just learning from cartoons, or
Mm.
and if we take the contrarian approach as scientists do, if they're only watching cartoons, how do they learn real life, real interaction sort of thing? Or is that teaching them something they shouldn't be learning?
Yeah, exactly.
They shouldn't be acting in that way or this way. Well, my argument against that argument would be, well, don't they have to learn the wrong things to learn what the right things are? This is something that I've seen in. So my sister's about 5 years younger than me, and my dad used to hate some of the TV my sister used to watch because it changed her language, it changed the way she behaved, and it wasn't the way that my dad wanted her to act. But she learnt that actually mimicking what happens on the shows doesn't really work in real life because people don't like it. So yeah, she learned those lessons, but she needed to learn those lessons. And some of the
Mm.
things from the show she still does. It's still part of her behavior and her characteristics because it's the experiences she had when she grew up. I think it's the same for everyone. But if we look at schools, if you blanket ban things or you blanket stop people from doing stuff, they can't make those mistakes. They can't make those errors because you haven't given them the opportunity to make those errors.
Mm.
So I wouldn't want to blanket ban things. So yes, there are limitations in the effectiveness of doing something and saying, hey, here's loads of opportunities. It might not be as effective in the short term, but we're not talking short term here. We're
No.
talking long term because that's what learning is. It's lifelong
Yeah.
learning.
Yeah.
That's me anyway.
Yeah.
If you do have any questions or comments, you can put them in the comment section below on YouTube, or I'm in Discord a lot, and I'm debating about putting these inside the Discord as well for people to move conversations forwards or move them into articles as well, because there are so many threads in here. I'm like, I know we're talking about this in the podcast, but this is a thread that could be on its own. It could be a separate thing. So I might put it into Discord so we can sort of connect some of those threads together, because especially these ones that divert back episodes and things like that.
Definitely. I agree.
So your pop experience, we discussed this briefly in the week.
Yes.
Explain what you said to me on Tuesday, but again now, anything else that's evolved throughout time.
Yeah, so one of the big differences I saw in your pop versus my pop was the session design thing that I didn't really understand or didn't have expertise in. And I thought, oh, that's something that's very different between us. A lot of what we believe and do matches quite similarly, which makes sense considering the conversations we have. But there are subtle differences. I'm still playing with curiosity. I'm not satisfied with that as a value, but I can't find another word yet. So I'm still kind of like playing with that, exploring the meaning of curiosity, messing around with that, going, okay, what do I actually mean? there is something to the learning element. That's the thing I find interesting, is learning. And so I'm like, okay, cool. But that still feels very empty and missing more. So playing with that. But anyway, that's what we're saying. Around like practice design, I noticed that actually I do exactly what you do. I have a warm up, and then I go into a session, and then I kind of cool down / warm up into the next session. And sometimes my actual sessions are, and they are often constrained. They are often like they have a directed, it's a goal directed behavior. I am going in this direction. I am completing this thing. I am setting up my Lorcana cards for XYZ. I am finishing off some work for a client. I am on Facebook replying to people, and they lead into other kind of activities, and they flow quite nicely into different sessions. And one is often a warm up for another, and then I have kind of a cool down period where I go away and I either spend time with Tori or do other things, which is a warm up for something else. And it's really interesting how I'm seeing those patterns, because now I assume I am becoming attuned to all of the techniques that you know from the science. And I'm like, oh, that is. And as I was saying to you, so I did a, what was it? Was it a rate of what is the thing that I did where I basically did
RPE,
way too much?
the RPE
RPE, is
thing,
that it? Yeah.
rate of perceived exertion.
Yeah. So I went very heavily on D&D and socializing to see where my limits lie.
Oh, max testing.
Yeah. So I was max testing for the last couple of weeks. I found that now, and I'm like, okay, cool. One, it was a brilliantly intense session, because my idea was I want to get better at DMing, at running sessions, because then I can be more efficient, which gives me back time. And I know my limits. So I found my limits, and now that is influencing how I plan my D&D sessions, because I've had this big intense session where I'm just like, okay, here is all that goes into it. Then I've been researching, then I've been doing more, and I'm now learning, or have been learning, what my limits are. And now I'm like, okay, cool. I can do this, because these are my limits. I can run 3 campaigns at a time, plus a mini online one for someone. But I want to work primarily with adults, primarily with people who have at least got some experience of playing D&D, because I don't really want to be going with lots of beginners. And so it's like, cool, that's where my current rate is. So that's helped put that into a kind of an understanding and expertise in what I wish to do and how much social I want to do.
Yeah.
And it's kind of helped me, and I'm noticing that I'm now bringing my work back in heavier again as we're coming to the end of the holidays and people are starting to come back. I'm like, okay, cool, I'm going to come in here doing warm-up sessions of work and then cool down sessions. And it's really interesting just seeing that whole periodization.
Yeah.
Seeing periodization just happening without knowing it's periodization.
Yeah, I think you're at the point where, so when I went from my second year to third year at uni, I decided I was going to drop one of my psychology modules for a strength and conditioning module. And strength and conditioning is essentially becoming a PT, a personal trainer, but for high performance athletes. And the strength and conditioning modules were so boring because it was all anatomy, physiology, biomechanics. And even though I liked those things, I liked the way it works, kinematics, kinetics, etc. of movement, it still didn't quite, yeah, that's it. That's what I want to be doing. And it wasn't until there was a lecture about halfway through my third year. So I've done this transition from second year to third year, from psychology to essentially the body. And it wasn't until this lecture that hardly anyone turned up to. There was meant to be, I think, 40, 45 people in the room, and there were like 6 or 7.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, like no one turned up to it. It was called planning the program. Like, why would someone care about that? But it was a 2-hour lecture about periodization. And when I listened to this lecture, I thought, hold up, this is basically calendar like calendar management. It's basically what
Yeah.
this thing is, right? And I found this really interesting because I was quite particular with my time at the time because I was doing so many things. Like I was training in 3 different sports, I was coaching in 4 different academies whilst like doing the degree thing. So my time was my time was full.
Whilst doing the degree thing, you know, that tiny little thing that I'm doing.
Yeah. So I was well into my calendar at that point. And when I heard this periodization thing, I was like, oh, okay. But what I missed in that lecture, which I found, luckily, I found in another lecture, which was to do with physiology. I can't remember what the module was called. It was a sports science module, which again went completely sideways. I took modules that went completely against the grain of my actual degree because I wanted to challenge myself. So I deliberately picked modules that I knew would be hard because I had no prior knowledge of it, because I wanted to push myself. And in this separate lesson, I found out about supercompensation and tapering and all these different concepts of how the body works. And I saw that. I saw periodization. I thought, oh, these 2 things work together. That's how strength and conditioning is planned out for a pro athlete over the 4 years for the Olympic cycle, whatever it is. Hold up a second. Why can't we do that? Why can't I train like a professional athlete and use this concept of periodization to manage myself? So I started doing that. And as soon as I started applying what I was learning through my degree to myself, becoming my own sports coach, essentially, I was periodizing my time. I was tapering. I was looking at supercompensation. I was measuring my load, rate of perceived exertion. I was using practice design and the constraints-led approach for me inside of the way I would enact in my sessions, using goal-directed behavior. I was applying all this science and stuff into my life. And now I'm like, well, duh, it's obvious. But I was doing it before I knew all these words, all these topics and terms and concepts. And it wasn't until I recognized, I became attuned to the information. I became attuned to the affordances rather than the information, because the information was already there. But I became attuned to the affordances of these concepts that I could then specialize. I could then, I guess, to use more appropriate terms, I could then be more specific or sensitive to that information, and that therefore increases my expertise. And then I can start adjusting it in smaller ways that other people don't necessarily see as an affordance because they're not familiar enough with the concepts. And I feel that's where you're at now. You've become familiar enough with the concept that you can go, hold up a second. If this could cause this or leans into that, maybe I do this for a little bit longer and see how that works. And you can start sort of testing yourself.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
That's what was happening. Yeah. It was like, okay, cool. I'm tired. I usually would just stop being social. And I did this yesterday. Literally yesterday. I was like, oh, I'm really tired. I don't want to go out anywhere. I'm not going to do anything. And then there was an offer to come down and do Locarno, which I'm kind of enjoying. I'm really enjoying it. Something that I can enjoy with my kids and enjoy socially on the side, with other people, which is what I want to be doing. So I was like, okay, cool. Let's go test that. Let's go and see whether I have reached, what is the term? It's not overexertion because that's not quite right, but it's that when it's
non-functional overreaching.
Overreaching, yeah, that's when it's beyond beneficial, and when there's
non-functional,
non-functional, so non-functional overreaching. So I was like, okay, let's see. And it was interesting how it wasn't overreaching, and I was like, oh, I'm not actually as tired as I think I would be. And I was like, that's fascinating. I thought I'd be dead this morning, but I'm not, because I'm engaging in stimulating conversation. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And we were talking about it before.
Yes, I love
and I was
this.
like, oh, shit, this is so cool.
So this is where I think the concept of supercompensation, I'm going really deep into the weeds now. I expressed this a little bit inside the Patreon pop event. So if you're a Patreon listening, then you can see the replay of that event. But essentially, this is going to be very simplified. When you train, if you start at arbitrary number of 0, you obviously expend energy, right? You're doing something. So say you go down a little bit, say -1. Supercompensation means your body is now adapting to it. So, okay, we're going to go up by 2. So we've gone from 0 to -1. Now we're at 1, right? That supercompensation is specific to an area inside of strength and conditioning. Typically, that would be strength or power or muscular endurance. But when we're looking at cognitive and psychological aspects, well, now we can constrain environments. Look at, using an ecological term here, an ecological niche. You can say, okay, inside of this environment, this social environment, I've hit my max load, the max testing for this ecological niche, and I'm going to supercompensate there. I'm going to get better than I was, so I can last longer in that the next time. When you change the context, you change the ecological niche, you change the environment that you're in, now that baseline is at 0 again because it's a different event. So you can now supercompensate. You can overreach in a new environment, which means you can overreach multiple times in a day without non-functional overreaching because you've context switched. And this to me is where the whole task switching thing, shouldn't task switch, blah, 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 is frustrating. Because if you say, I'm going to do a day of this editing thing, I'm going to devote my day to editing. Well, now, because you're not context switching, that can be non-functional overreaching. So instead of
which is why I've never, like, shifting it to a business perspective, which is why I've never understood batching content. Because it's just, I can batch content, but I am functionally overreaching very quickly.
Non-functionally overreaching.
Non-functionally overreaching, thank you.
And that is where knowing your load matters, because some people can batch it because they can do a whole day and it be functional. Some people can't because it's non-functional for them because they don't have the expertise. Their arbitrary baseline of 0 is not at 0 when you compare the two people, because non-functional overreaching, using these arbitrary numbers that I'm talking about, we go from 0, -1 because we've expended energy, but we start doing something again before we supercompensate to 1. So we go from 0, -1, maybe you get to 0, but then you go again. Well, now you're going down to -2. And then when you go up to supercompensate, instead of supercompensating back to 1, you're now at -1. And then you go again. So say, for example, you have 3 editing sessions in a day instead of 1. You do 1 session, you go from 0 to -1 to 1. You do 3 sessions, you go from 0 to -1, then to 0, then to -2, then to -1, now to -3.
So, and now that's that rate of you just pushing.
And now you start going down, which means in order to get back to 0, you have to not do anything for a day, 2 days, 3 days, rest and recover. So instead of doing 3 editing sessions on 1 day, then not doing any editing for 2 days, you could just do an editing session each day. And then at the end of those 3 days, if you've done it a blocked 1 day and then 2 days, you go from 0 to 0 because you've had to rest and recover. But if you've done it sectioned, you've gone from 0 to 3. So what would you prefer to do? You batch it in 1 day and go from baseline 0 to 0 because you needed to rest and recover, or you go from 0 to 3 because you spread it out over 3 days. I think that's a no-brainer. And this is how athletes train. This is why they spread out their load. This is why they periodize their sessions. Why don't we do this in the way that we manage our energy inside of work and school? Because the concept isn't taught to us, so we can't manipulate those elements. Hopefully this is making sense. Obviously, this is audio. I'm thinking of doing a video about this, explaining this concept, but yeah.
Yeah, I think I want to understand the theory now. So I'm like, oh, do you have that in your vault?
I don't have it expressed in a way that would make sense to someone that isn't me.
Cool.
I do post a couple of images inside the Patreon event that I mentioned earlier, so you can look at those images.
Yeah, because that'd be useful to kind of, because now I know what I'm doing. I want to, I think we spoke about this ages ago. I have this much knowledge of it and I'm teetering on the edge. So I want to just go, what? Let's expand that a little bit so I'm not like, oh.
Yeah, I can. The image I'm imagining is you've got the cylinder and then you've got the balance board. That's what I imagine you on. You're sort of like putting your feet and then you're like going side to side, like wobbling. You're like, I'm
just like,
I
need this to get bigger a little bit, please.
Yeah, I'm there with like two square blocks just firmly stood there, and you're like, yeah, hold up, you. But I feel like that's where I'm at when I'm speaking with other individuals in free energy principle and maximum energy efficiency and those sort of theories. I'm like, hold up, give me a second right now.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask you a bunch of questions after we finish about papers and stuff to look at.
Nice. Sounds good. Right. So moving into the comment section, there's been some great comments coming in on YouTube. I've been liking them, hearting them. But quite a few of them aren't things that we can expand on very easily. They're sort of like they liked using the tool, they didn't like using that tool, they liked hearing this thing, and they shared their thoughts on it. But I got this comment from Dovas from a previous episode about social media. And they listed some points, and I wanted to explore those points just a tad. The first one, the character count is way too small to write anything useful inside of one message. And that's referring to Twitter, or X as it's now called. Yeah. So I agree and disagree. I agree the character count is small. I agree it is too small to express some meaningful content, some meaningful conversations. But I think the constraint affords different ways of communicating information, and the constraint constrains individuals' ability to express information. And I would argue if some people can't express information in that amount of characters, then they don't have a deep enough understanding of what it is they're talking about, or the level of expertise difference between you and the person you're speaking with is too great to be had with that constraint. In other words, if I'm talking to someone that doesn't understand ecological dynamics or ecological psychology or the ecological approach in general, and they've asked me a question about it, I'm not going to explore many of the topics and concepts in an explanation because it will require added information not to be oversimplified. So the expertise gap there informs how I'm going to use the constraint to help me in that conversation. So that to me exposes some of what I find some of the really good parts about Twitter. But it's when the constraint creates an issue, that's where I think the conversation needs to go elsewhere. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, yeah, I am the exact same. It's that adage of if you can't explain things simply, etc., etc. That whole thing is like flawed in its case. It's like yes, but
it depends who you're talking to.
Yeah, and I think that is the hard thing with like social media, public social media, is having those conversations of like that type is much harder to do in tiny little snippets. And I think that was something that when I was doing social media, I really struggled with. And still do to a certain degree, which is why I like having deep conversations with people. Like, it's not that you can't have deep conversations with people on Twitter. You can't, not easily, but
again, I think it depends who you're speaking to.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the interactions I have with Twitter, I don't know how many people. I keep calling it Twitter. I'm going to call it Twitter because it's easier. But a lot of the interactions I have with people on Twitter in the academic space inside of my educational science list, they are extremely deep. Like we are talking about comparing three fundamentally different philosophical approaches that are rooted in centuries of discussion. And that conversation can be conveyed in a couple of sentences with some very specific terms and words used with combined meaning behind those words and terms. So that is extremely dense, but that is with two people that have similar levels of expertise in the conversation topic. It's where you have varying levels of expertise in a conversation that I see friction points happen. What's worrying to me is when people think they have expertise in a topic of conversation, they share potential thoughts, points, topics about their perceived level of expertise. I don't want to say Dunning-Kruger effect because I don't think that's applicable here, but it's somewhat related. And then instead of having a counter argument or a point to go against it, they then use the emotional argument of you're attacking them, or I'm attacking you, or you're attacking each other, or this is just argument for argument's sake.
Yes.
There are lots of examples of that all over Twitter from literally every span of the world, and it's even in academia. Like, academia even has this problem. That's what the Harvard scandal was all about with Francesca Gino. She basically was accused of making things up. And instead of having a counter argument or a rebuttal or publishing something to say, actually, I disagree with you, she sued them. Like, why can't you just have a discussion about this? Her argument is, oh, money, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, great. But when you look at the science, someone said, I disagree with you, and you said, I'm going to sue you. I don't get the logic. Okay, I'll rephrase that. I do get the logic. I don't agree with the logic. So
Yeah.
That's a very diverse conversation from the original point, which was about character count on Twitter or X. But that's the way I see the character count. It's a constraint that affords opportunities, and the opportunities of behavior is what I would love to see. That's why I love Twitter. A lot of people say, oh, Twitter's this, Twitter's that, Twitter's toxic. No, it's not. You are perceiving Twitter as toxic because you're not looking deep enough into the conversation, the relationship between the two individuals or three, multiple individuals in the conversation. I would see that as a problem with your interpretation of the conversation rather than the conversation itself, because I very rarely see toxic conversation. I see a point that could be perceived as emotionally driven. Yes, everything's emotionally driven, but it doesn't inherently come with a toxic view. Even with politicians, you can say, inside the education field at the moment, Gillian, who's the education secretary in the UK, she posts something and you're going to get loads of people saying, you should be doing this, you should be solving this, you should be solving that. And it's emotionally driven from people not getting the right wages as teachers. Yes, you could see that as, okay, Gillian is doing things wrong or not doing things well enough for these people, or these people are arguing against them and fighting for freedom against power, whatever you want to talk about with the interpretation. But at the end of the day, it's a person that's trying to do something and people that want her to do something else. So how do we have a conversation about that? And those are the points missed on Twitter and X. Okay. Point 2. Even if you write many messages, there's a chance that people don't see them or see them out of context from the earlier messages.
This is exactly what you were just saying. Exactly the point. You only see half of it, miss the context, and then...
I feel that this is not a problem that can be solved by tech or by a device.
No, it's human.
Yeah. I think they're user errors. I think the lack of skill in the public to be diligent enough to find the context is the issue, not the tech itself.
No, the tech's fine. There's nothing wrong with the tech. The tech has threads. You pull it up, see the rest of the context. Come on.
And I think what would be useful as a cultural move or cultural shift is that instead of assuming the person has the full context, when you read their response, confirm that. And this comes from motivational interviewing.
Yeah.
Instead of assuming what you think they mean, confirm what they mean with them. So instead of saying, oh, you're wrong because blah, 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 or I disagree with you because blah, 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 say, do you mean this from what they said here? Or is your meaning the same as this meaning? And this is what I do in my conversations all the time. And I actually find, kind of ironically, that is where people stop. That's where people stop responding. Because that then is me arguing with them with the words that they've chosen to use. And if you don't have an argument against yourself, you don't understand what it is that you're talking about well enough.
Mm.
And that's where people start to get emotional. That's the whole point of motivational interviewing, is to dive in deep at the emotional points, the emotional triggers, the rooted beliefs that you hold. And that's what I wish other people would do as a culture. Be psychologically safe to say, okay, I assume you mean this from this. Have you thought about it? Like, have you used this quote or thought about it from this perspective, from this lens, or is it just that one? And that to me is being empathetic with other people, just in general.
Mm.
How do we do that? I think we just need to do it. You can't tell people to do something if you're not doing it yourself. And this is where, inside of my POP, behavioral integrity. If you're going to tell someone to be empathetic with people, or if you're going to tell someone that, oh yeah, we need to understand where other people are coming from, we need to understand perspectives, then actually understand perspectives. Go into the conversation. Don't just respond once or twice and then expect that to be good enough, because you can't send one or two messages with a couple of words and then expect to understand their perspective or the meaning behind the conversation or the point or the topic that they're making. And I would imagine everyone can think of multiple examples from all different fields where someone has made an assumption and the assumption was built on a misunderstanding of communication. Happens all over the place.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add? Because I feel like I'm just sitting here ranting.
No, I just agree with you. I'm like, yeah.
Okay, we'll move on to point 3 then. All answers to one tweet are now the source of new answers that can themselves have answers that are without connection to other answers. I'm going to tie this in with the next couple because I think these are all related. That means one tweet with hundreds of answers is already fractured into hundreds of conversations. If these hundreds of answers get tens of answers, then you have thousands of conversations, which means it can be impossible to follow the conversations and arguments all the way back to the original person. This, to me, emphasizes the butterfly effect, which is ingrained inside complexity theory, which is part of dynamical systems, which I think is a good thing.
Yes. I'm reading all that going, yes, good. Yes, good. Yes, good. And I think it goes back to that idea of like being productive and not spending time online and wasting time listening to others' opinions. And I'm like, but to me, that's the most interesting. Like seeing diverging opinions and going, oh, that's interesting. I see that. Oh, is that what you mean? Or is that what you mean? And like asking those questions of like that is part of what my pop is, and kind of surmises that curiosity word that I'm still not quite happy with. But that surmises like I'm like, oh, that's so cool. I didn't see. Okay, cool. Oh, that's interesting. Like one of the things that I'm really finding interesting now is the environment. I have been in a solopreneur, like other business owner environment, online business owner environment for a long time, nearly 10 years.
You're old.
Yeah, all right. We've gathered that.
And there are probably listeners that are older than that. And they're like, oh, excuse me.
Yeah. And it's been really interesting to step away from that.
I guess from context, I have been online, as in actually online social media, for maybe 4 years. Maybe. I think it's 3 pushing 4.
All right, yeah, you are. Wow. Mm-hmm.
Just for context.
I do feel old. There goes my back. Yeah. I remember your first video that I saw.
Oh, the first video that I saw. Yeah. I was going to say first video that's on
your Notion one. It was one of your Notion ones in the Facebook group.
Oh, wow.
I remember seeing your first video.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I don't even remember what it was, but I remember it being like I think it's like, this is a Notion page, or it's like a really simple one, I think.
Yeah.
I would have to look back on the channel, but yeah, it's been a while. It's mildly ironic that I'm 3-4 years down the line and I'm still saying the same thing I started with, is contribute to the conversation. Contribute to the conversation is what I started my channel based and built around, because the conversation is where the majority of beneficial and effective learning comes from. But if you're not involved in the conversation, you can't engage in the education that it encompasses. And that's why I'm so, I don't want to say passionate, because I don't think it encompasses the full range of emotions about the Discord and about the community that I engage in. And I don't say
Yeah.
community by, oh, it's the Discord community. No, it's everyone I engage with. That's the Discord for Obsidian, for Morgan, for myself, and Colin Samir, and the other Discords I'm engaged in, as well as the conversations on Twitter. Like, they are part of what I would class as my community, my social community, my ecological niche, if you will, of conversation.
I think that's something. So from a business perspective, for so long I've been told by experts not to have a community, because the assumption is I wouldn't be able to keep up with it. And the more I'm exploring this, I'm like, I do struggle with lots of engagement. But that was the assumption I had up until recently, when I realized how much engagement I can actually deal with. And it's now where I'm like, okay, cool. Community. Interesting. Because that is where I feel that I'm heading, is to either create or be part of a bigger part of perhaps yours community, and like actually perhaps a business focused orientation of that. And I'm like, that's so interesting.
That's a perfect example of where you can use a max rep test.
Yeah.
How do you max rep test being involved in a community? Spend a day, spend an hour, spend a week actively involved in a community. Or what I would do, because this is less of a rep thing, because it's less of one session, it's more of a continued involvement. So this is where you would do, inside of periodization, you'd call it a microcycle, which in physical stuff, that's normally like 2 to 4 weeks. But you would engage in a type of training for a length of time, 2 to 4 weeks, a microcycle, and see how your body, or you in this case, because we're engaged in cognitive as well, reacts to that. So I'm going to engage myself in that community for a week, for 2 weeks, and see how I react to that. What are good, what are bad, what work, what doesn't work, what drains me, what invigorates me. Because maybe you can sit there for like 2 hours responding to loads and loads of messages, and then you look at the clock and go, wow, it's been 2 hours. Oh, okay. I can engage in this. Or maybe you look at the threads and go, I really don't care about what you're talking about. I'm going to leave.
Yep.
Both of those are beneficial, especially for engaging in community. And of course, you're always welcome, John, in the community.
Of course.
Yeah, and this is something that I've learned inside of Discord, which is why I spend so much of my time inside of Discord, and not necessarily pushing people towards Discord, but encouraging people to go to Discord, because in there you can link between videos, between articles, and between past and present and future conversations, all in one place, and being able to tag, mention, search, all of these sorts of things in a conversation, whereas Twitter X can get lost. Threads do get overwhelming, and it's not as easy to find things back on Twitter as it is in Discord, especially the way that I've set out my Discord with the forums. You can just browse through the forums, like, oh yeah, that's the thread I want. Or you can look at the tag and go, okay, that's the type of conversation I'm looking for right now. Am I looking for a question? Am I looking for a discussion? And as discussions evolve, I would imagine discussion style tabs will come in. Are we talking about educational systems here? Are we talking about philosophies here? Are we talking about periodization here? Like those sorts of types of conversation, types of discussions. So if you want to go in and be like, hey, I want to talk about business, I want to talk about learning, online learning, content creation, maybe that becomes a tagged thread inside of discussions.
Yeah.
And you can't do that on most social media platforms. You'd need a community platform to do that. And Discord's free, it's accessible to everyone, and you can do all the things you'd really need to do. You got threads.
And I mean, one thing I did find overwhelming with what I do find overwhelming with Discord is all the messages. However, with these kind of like more forum based kind of threads, that I enjoy a lot because I'm like, I can just go in, I'm just looking at yours, like Obsidian, onboarding update, cool, school has failed you, cool, sitting on the like I can, it feels more like a
Reddit?
bulletin board, which
Yeah.
you probably, please say you know that.
Yeah, I know
Okay,
what a bulletin
good.
board is.
I thought I'd be really old then.
No, I know what a bulletin board is. Well, think about it. My education has been about education. So I've gone
yeah,
all
good
the way
point.
back to like the 1800s and how they used
That's
this
true.
education there. So
Yeah.
if
So
I didn't know what a bulletin board is, I'd like fish slap myself.
yeah. So and it's very, very much like the traditional forums, which is where I started, and I love communities like that.
Mm. That's why I've tried to emphasize the use of forums inside of my Discord. Yes, I have. So I have a couple of forums that are restricted on what can be added, such as the YouTube
Yeah.
channel and the event recaps, because obviously I don't want everyone posting random stuff in there. But I do have the discussion and the question forums where people can bring in any discussion topic that's interesting to explore. But sometimes, as you'll see in the general chat, a question or a point or a topic or a statement doesn't need an entire thread.
Yeah.
And that's combining those two things together, I just think is really nice. And having stages. So for those unfamiliar, I do a stage every Friday. One, so it's bi-weekly. One is an open week, then it's a Patreon week, then it's an open week and a Patreon week. So it goes back and forth. And having those stages, one gives me a chance to present what's happened in the community, kind of like a recap of conversations that's happened, but also an opportunity for other people to talk and engage in the conversation at a time, rather than it being all asynchronistic. Everyone can sort of come together and be like, okay, let's all like ground our ideas together and have a chat. As it grows, maybe that turns into more than once a week, or maybe we have more than one person talking on stage. But again, that's action and perception coupled together.
Yeah. It's really good. It's getting my like ooh.
It's getting my ooh.
Yeah. Ooh.
Right. Nice. So with that, I think we can close out the episode for today. So thanks for listening.
Bye.